On April 19th, 1993, in Waco, Texas, 76 men, women, and children, part of a religious sect, arguably a cult, died in a massive fire while over 900 law enforcement agents surrounded their compound and watched, unable to interrupt the tragedy many argue was their fault. Some died from the fire itself, while others died from gunshot wounds, some self-inflicted, others by the hands of their fellow cult members, and then some potentially from the federal government itself. It was the end of a 51-day standoff with the US government, and it was a standoff that began when federal agents stormed the compound under the guise of seizing illegal firearms, and ended with tanks, tear gas, and a fire that consumed almost everyone inside. This event was broadcasted live on TV into millions of American homes, and it left many of them divided about what really happened at Waco. Was it a case of law enforcement overreach, the government turning tanks and tear gas on its own citizens? Or was it the inevitable collapse of a dangerous and pedophilic cult led by a man who believed he spoke for God? Here's the thing. We have the government on one side, unleashing psychological warfare and armored vehicles onto American soil. But we also have a man named David Koresh, a self-proclaimed prophet who manipulated, abused, and controlled his followers. He married little girls, abused kids, fathered children with teenagers, and convinced his people that he alone could unlock God's secrets. It puts us in a tough position. Our brains want things to be easy, a black and white binary situation. We want to have a villain and we want to have a hero, so we are desperate to answer the question of who's in the wrong here. But reality is an uncomfortable truth because both sides are in the wrong. It's not clear cut. We have government abuse and overreach. We have the FBI and ATF refusing to thoroughly study the Branch Davidians as a religion in order to reach a peaceful conclusion. And we also have a dangerous cult leader who preyed on young girls and stubbornly refused to let his people go. And this tension, this uncomfortable position that we are in right now, that's why Waco still matters. See, 2 years later, Timothy McVeigh would bomb the Oklahoma City Federal Building, killing 168 people, citing Waco as one of his inspirations. And to this day, conspiracy theorists, militia movements, and anti-government extremists point to Waco as proof of federal tyranny. And David Koresh himself predicted to his followers that there would be a clash with the government, and he proclaimed they must stay strong in the face of that fight. Some might argue that when you're stocking up on firearms, potentially illegally selling the firearms or sawing off the barrel of shotguns, and assaulting little girls, predicting a run-in with the feds isn't particularly far-fetched. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. But others point out that even if this was an obvious path towards a clash with law enforcement, the way the government handled it added ample amounts of fuel to an already raging fire. Obviously, no pun intended there. They argue that the government still abused its authority and killed innocent victims who were already in a vulnerable position, actually many of them being victims themselves. There were other very obvious and better ways to handle the situation, and many say that at the end of the day, the government, which already had the upper hand, is to blame for the entire situation. To better understand how the smoke and fire of Waco came to be, we're going to go back all the way to the birth of a child named Vernon Wayne Howell, who later became known as David Koresh, a boy who never fit in, who turned to scripture to save him, and who grew into a man who believed he was chosen by God to prepare the world for the apocalypse.
Well, the leader of this Branch Davidians cult calls himself David Koresh.
This event was totally unprecedented in law enforcement history.
Met by a hail of gunfire, killing 4 of the agents and wounding over a dozen others.
David Koresh was, like I said, not born as David Koresh. He came into the world on August 17th, 1959 in Houston, Texas, under the name of Vernon Wayne Howell. And if you only knew the name Vernon Howell, you'd probably never guess that this boy would grow up to become one of the most infamous cult leaders in American history. From the beginning, Vernon's life was marked by instability. His mother was just a teenager when she gave birth to him, and his father wasn't around. Vernon grew up bouncing between relatives, never quite fitting in anywhere. And that rootlessness, that feeling of being unwanted, would stick with him for his entire life. And school didn't offer him any refuge either. He suffered from dyslexia and poor eyesight, which made academics a constant struggle. And as you'd expect, because we know kids can be cruel, no one helped him. They actually just mocked him. The kids even gave him a nickname, Vernie, which he despised. And when you're already lonely and self-conscious, being laughed at every day only deepens that isolation. So Vernon turned inward. He found comfort not in friends, but in two main obsessions, music and the Bible. He'd spend hours with his guitar, and even more hours poring over scripture. While most kids his age were playing baseball or riding bikes, Vernon was memorizing entire chapters of the King James Bible. By the time he was 12, people claimed he could recite the entire thing. You could quote him a random verse, and he'd fire back with where it was in the Bible within seconds. A lot of people focus on this obsession of his as a dark foreshadowing of his future endeavors. But it also highlights just how intelligent Vernon was. Think about it for a moment. A 12-year-old boy, isolated, bullied, and desperate for validation, like any child is at that age, finds his identity in the Bible. And here's the thing, that's not abnormal. People find their identity in a lot of different things. We all struggle with loneliness throughout our lives, and finding order in that chaos is essential. Also, humans are always seeking answers to the many questions that our consciousness plagues us with. Why are we here? Why does evil exist? What is my purpose? Nothing's wrong with finding solace in the Bible and dedicating your life to learning it. Many scholars have done that and are still doing that. But for Vernon, this obsession grew into something more because it became dangerous. Vernon was baptized as a born-again Christian at a Southern Baptist church, but he quickly started clashing with their teachings. He didn't just sit quietly in the pews, he argued with other congregants, insisting that his interpretation of the Bible was the correct one. Eventually, he moved on to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, hoping to find a spiritual home that better matched his interest in prophecy and apocalyptic teachings. But Vernon was not the kind of guy who played well with authority. Even as a teenager, he believed he had a direct line to God. That arrogance eventually got him expelled from the church after he told the pastor that God wanted him to take the pastor's 12-year-old daughter as his wife. That moment is chilling in hindsight because it foreshadowed what would become one of the most disturbing and abusive aspects of his later life, his fixation on underage girls, justifying this obsession using scripture. At the time, it was a dangerous delusion, but later it became something he acted upon, and something he convinced his followers to agree with. Vernon dropped out of Garland High School his senior year and took a job as a carpenter, which isn't that surprising given his interest in the Bible. And his obsession with scripture continued to grow. He did not want to look towards others to tell him what scripture meant. He was convinced his interpretation was paramount, and while his followers may agree with him, many on the outside just saw it as him bending the scripture to his will and his interests. This was the early shaping of a man who would later convince dozens of people to surrender their lives and their children's lives in the name of his vision of God's plan. After Vernon Howell dropped out of high school and started working as a carpenter, he was just another young man drifting through life in Texas. He had the Bible, yeah, but he didn't have direction. And like a lot of restless 20-somethings, he thought maybe his ticket out was music. In the early 1980s, Vernon made his way out to Los Angeles with dreams of becoming a rock star. He wrote songs, played guitar, and even put together a small band. But not necessarily shocking, he struggled to stand out in LA, which is full of kids who think they're destined for stardom. Vernon would later prove to be charismatic enough to lead a cult, but I guess that kind of charisma didn't transfer over to the musical world, and as a result, his dreams quickly fizzled out. While Vernon may not have been cut out for fame through music, he was convinced he was special, that he was different, and he just needed to find an outlet for his unique abilities. So when music failed, he fell back on the one thing he always had, the Bible. And that's where his personality really shined. By his early 20s, Vernon started drifting towards groups that shared his apocalyptic worldview. This is how he found the Branch Davidians, a splinter offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church out near Waco, Texas. They were already a fringe sect interested in end-time prophecy and the coming apocalypse. To Vernon, it was like stepping into a room full of people who spoke his language. But he didn't just join them. he made himself indispensable. Vernon would play guitar and sing during Bible study sessions, charming the congregation with both his music and his knowledge of Scripture. And it wasn't long before he caught the eye of Lois Rawdon, the widow of the sect's founder. According to some accounts, Vernon and Lois engaged in a sexual relationship. He was in his 20s, she was in his or her 60s. And while that detail alone makes most people raise an eyebrow, Vernon told others that God himself had ordained their relationship. He claims God wanted him to father a child with Lois, a child who would become the chosen one. That claim didn't sit well with everyone, especially Lois's son, George Rawdon. George saw Vernon as a threat to his control of the group. His father had died, leaving him and his mother behind. As a result, he was next in the line to lead the congregation, and he did not take kind to Vernon stepping in and stealing the limelight. On top of that, and understandably so, he was not a fan of Vernon claiming his 60-year-old mother was to sire his child. George tried to litigate Vernon out of the church by filing a lawsuit claiming Vernon assaulted and brainwashed his mother, but was unsuccessful. While litigation is already an aggressive step for a lot of people, their rivalry only got worse and eventually spiraled into violence, which we'll get to that in a moment. Now, the controversy with George didn't stall Vernon. He was starting to shape his own vision for leadership. Since it didn't seem like Lois was gonna work out, he ended up marrying a 14-year-old Branch Davidian named Rachel Jones, and together they had 2 children. He also began preaching his own lectures, which he called the Serpent's Root. In these teachings, Vernon presented himself not just as a student of the Bible, but as someone uniquely positioned to interpret its deepest mysteries. And this is where we see a huge shift. He was no longer the awkward boy obsessed with Scripture. He was becoming the man who would bend the Scripture to his will. A man who would say and could say, God told me to do this. God told you to obey me. God told you to do this. And within the Branch Davidians, some people listened. And as we can guess at this point, Vernon wasn't content being a background figure or a second in command. He wanted to be the sole leader. And Vernon challenged George all the time. And that challenging had support within the congregation. See, after George's dad had died, George was on a quest to remake Mount Carmel into his own image, even renaming it Rawdonville. According to his followers, he was acting like a tyrant, and they were sick of his shit. As a result, Koresh's conflict with George Rawdon escalated into open hostility. At one point, Rawdon accused Vernon of setting a fire that destroyed part of the compound, a blaze that Vernon just shrugged off as God's judgment. Eventually, George and his supporters drove Vernon and his followers out of Mount Carmel Center at gunpoint. But that was not the last they saw of Vernon. For a while, Vernon and his small group lived out in the woods of East Texas, where he successfully recruited new followers. And here's the thing about isolation. It hardens belief. Cut off from the outside world, Vernon doubled down on his vision. He even traveled to Israel, where he claimed to have a revelation that he was the modern-day reincarnation of the biblical king Cyrus, the liberator of the Jews from Babylon. When Vernon returned to Texas, he came back armed, both literally and spiritually, and this terrified George. In an attempt to solidify his control over the congregation, George challenged Vernon to a contest, a duel, if you will. Whichever man could raise the dead would be the rightful spiritual leader of the Branch Davidians. Which is pretty typical duel, right? It's what you would expect between 2 power-hungry men vying for control of a group of people, right? Anyway, Vernon strategically had a little chat with Waco authorities because George, in his desperation to prove himself, had illegally exhumed a woman who had been dead and buried for 20 years and began praying over her in an attempt to bring her back from the dead. According to Vernon, he went to Mount Carmel to take photos of George's illegal activity to try help the police out, help him build a case. In his attempt to act as an undercover spy, Vernon's followers clashed with George and his followers, and a gunfight ensued. George was shot but survived. Of course, Vernon's defense was that he was simply on Mount Carmel grounds to retrieve photographic evidence. But interestingly enough, Vernon had forgotten to bring a camera with him. The case went to trial, and Vernon and his men were charged with attempted murder. But there was a mistrial, and him and his followers were acquitted. Now, George Rawdon, meanwhile, spiraled further into madness and later killed his roommate with an axe, believing the man had been sent by Vernon to assassinate him. A jury declared Rawdon insane, and he was committed to a mental hospital. With George out of the way, Vernon moved in and seized control of Mount Carmel compound, and in 1990 he legally changed his name. Vernon Wayne Howell was no more. He was now David Koresh, a name that carried biblical weight. David after King David, and Koresh, the Hebrew form of Cyrus. It was a calculated move. He was positioning himself as a prophet, a leader, even a messianic figure. And now, with full control of the Branch Davidians, he finally had the stage he had always been looking for. And this is where things took an even darker turn. Koresh began teaching what he called spiritual weddings. These weddings were created by Koresh's interpretation of the Bible and his communications with God, and they allowed him to take women and girls as his wives. He told his followers that God had anointed him with the right to choose partners, regardless of their age or marital status. Koresh believed he was the perfect mate for all female members and intended to create a new lineage of children who he believed would rule the world. Some of these so-called brides were as young as 11 years old. Others were the legal wives of men who had already given their loyalty to Koresh. He told those men it was God's will that they give up their wives to him, and unbelievably, they did just that. At the time, Texas's age of consent was 17 years old. Koresh simply rewrote the rules inside the compound, and because scripture was always his weapon, he used the Bible to justify his abuse. By some estimates, Koresh had more than 20 wives, many of them teenagers, and fathered a dozen or more children. To outsiders, this was horrifying, and this is one of the most disturbing aspects of cult psychology. Once people believe someone is the creator of morality, the unthinkable becomes accepted, and in some cases, even sacred. Despite this warped view of biblical teachings, people kept flocking to him and his congregation. He attracted followers not just from Texas, but across the world. Families traveled from as far away as Australia to join him in Waco, handing over their lives to him and the congregation at Mount Carmel. But although David was active in keeping everything tight and orderly at Mount Carmel, whispers started leaking out. Rumors of the child abuse and forced marriages began to circulate, as well as the belief that the Branch Davidians were stockpiling massive numbers of firearms to defend themselves against the government. Texas Child Protective Services eventually launched investigations into the compound. But Koresh was always one step ahead. He instructed his followers to pose as couples, assigning husbands and wives on paper to make everything look legal, and he groomed and trained the children to stay quiet about what was happening inside. As a result, without hard evidence, the investigation stalled. Koresh had transformed Mount Carmel into his kingdom under the guise of it being an earthly kingdom for God. Literally, according to him, it was not just a religious retreat, but rather the earthly site of the Davidic kingdom, the place where God's prophecy would unfold. He told his followers they were God's chosen army. So they began stockpiling weapons, which Koresh claimed were for defense, but others within the sect said they were sold at gun shows to fund the compound. It was probably a combination of both. As Koresh continued to build his army, instill his teachings, and take children as his wives, he was setting the stage for the coming clash with the government, one Koresh himself had predicted. He claimed this clash was not only inevitable, but divinely ordained. Although Texas Child Protective Services was unsuccessful in infiltrating the Branch Davidians and saving the children, by the early 1990s, Koresh's kingdom at Mount Carmel was only attracting more attention. Specifically, the Branch Davidians landed on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms radar, aka the ATF. The ATF had been building a case against Koresh for a while, claiming the Branch Davidians were illegally modifying firearms and sawing off shotguns. There were even rumors of a meth lab inside the compound, though that has never been substantiated. What was real, however, was the growing arsenal: guns, ammo, grenades. While for the Branch Davidians this was seen as a defense or an income generator, the ATF saw it as a dangerous cult arming itself for war, potentially against the government or other citizens. Now, here's where the government made its first critical mistake. Instead of taking time to understand who the Branch Davidians were, a religious apocalyptic sect that could have been negotiated with, they planned a raid that looked more like a military assault. In fact, the operation itself was nicknamed Operation Trojan Horse. What's even more crazy is that the ATF actually had a search warrant for Mount Carmel, but instead of going that route, they decided to make a surprise forced entry rather than serve that warrant. And then on top of that, apparently Koresh would take runs every morning on the same route, and the ATF knew about that route, so they could have gone out and arrested him, but they decided to do the surprise attack instead at the compound. Another critical mistake that escalated the situation is that Koresh actually knew they were coming. A local postal worker, who also happened to be Koresh's brother-in-law, I don't know which one, tipped him off after a journalist asked him for directions to Mount Carmel. Word got back to Koresh before the ATF even loaded their guns. So when the ATF rolled up on February 28th, 1993, Koresh and his followers were waiting. Now what happened next is still contested. Of course, the ATF maintains the initial shots came from inside the compound, and they responded in defense. Survivors inside Mount Carmel say the ATF purposefully fired first, and some accounts suggest that the opening volley was a negligent discharge by an ATF agent. But what isn't disputed is that once the shooting began, a 4-hour gun battle ensued, leaving 4 ATF agents and 6 Davidians dead. Koresh himself was hit in the stomach and arm, and he told his followers he expected to die that very day. Except he didn't. This entire situation was a public disaster, with news cameras capturing ambulances driving to the scene, injured ATF agents trying to climb into the compound's windows, gunfire everywhere. It was a total bloodbath, very different from the swift surgical strike the ATF had promised everyone. After that, the FBI was called in to take over, with 900 law enforcement officials descending on the compound. Media access was cut, and the only conduit in or out was a team of 25 negotiators. The FBI set up a perimeter around the compound, and what followed was a 51-day siege, which is the longest standoff in American law enforcement history. And here's where the internal conflict began. Some FBI negotiators believed they could take Koresh down and convince him to surrender peacefully. Others saw him as a manipulative psychopath holding innocent victims hostage and who would never give up willingly. Those factions inside the FBI clashed almost as much as the feds and the Davidians did on the outside. And then, on the Mount Carmel side, Koresh was spinning his own narrative. He framed the Branch Davidians not as his hostages, but as believers who were consciously and purposefully staying and choosing to stay within the walls of Mount Carmel. And he even made videos to support his point.
I'd like to share with you some of my family, and we just thought we'd kind of break the ice and allow people to see just exactly, what kind of people we have here. I'd like to start off first of all with my oldest son. His name is Cyrus. Come sit over here, son. How old are you?
7.
7. Say hello to everybody.
Hi.
Wave at them. The camera right there.
When the FBI took over, it seemed they may be able to defuse the situation. Koresh traded children's release for radio broadcasts of his sermons. But like I said, there was disagreement within the federal agents, and that disagreement led to a confusing negotiation tactic. On one hand, it seemed the negotiations were focused on securing cooperation, a bit of a give and a get situation. But on the other hand, the tactical team started escalating the pressure to try force Koresh's hand. They kept floodlights on all night, pointed at the compound in an effort to deprive the Davidians of sleep. They had low-flying helicopters above, and they looped loud audio of speeding trains, hovering choppers, Christmas carols, Islamic prayer calls, Buddhist chants, and even Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Are Made for Walking" at all hours of the day and night. This was a form of psychological warfare designed to break the will of the people. But this wasn't a classic hostage barricade, nor was this an actual wartime scenario. These were apocalyptic believers. They were God's army. Every time the feds rolled in a tank or blasted music at 3 a.m, it only confirmed what Koresh had been preaching, that the government was the enemy, and that the Davidians were God's chosen army. Which, if the FBI or the ATF did any research on the religious sect, they would have known this. But they didn't do that. Now, at this time, a man named James Tabor and his fellow scholars of a Christian apocalyptic movements tried a different approach. Although they couldn't intervene directly, they used a local radio broadcast the Davidians were known to listen to. With the scholars' help, Koresh agreed to draft and release a manuscript of his interpretation of the seven seals of Revelation, and then surrender. It was a path to end the siege without more bloodshed. But the FBI bungled even this potential peace deal because they failed to provide writing materials for Koresh, and then 5 days after the agreement, they completely lost patience and reversed course. U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno gave the green light for a final assault. At dawn on April 19th, 1993, combat engineering vehicles punched holes in the walls of Mount Carmel and pumped tear gas into the compound. It was the first time in U.S. history that tanks were used against American civilians. When Davidians fired their guns, agents responded with grenades and more gas. The original idea was to force the Davidians out without bloodshed. But that's not what happened. Instead, chaos erupted. Fires broke out in 3 different parts of the compound. To this day, there's still debate over how this happened. Tear gas is very flammable, and some say that's what started the fires. But others say the Davidians themselves intentionally set those fires. In 1999, the US government did admit that federal agents had fired flammable material into or near the Branch Davidian compound prior to the fire. Within minutes, the compound became a labyrinth of heat, smoke, and fire. 76 people died, 24 of them being children. Only 9 people made it out alive, and David Koresh was later found with a gunshot wound to the head. While it was described as self-inflicted, we don't know for sure what actually happened within the walls of that compound. What began as a botched raid had turned into one of the most catastrophic law enforcement operations in U.S. history. And worse, it was exactly the ending Koresh had foretold. He told his followers that a war was coming, and then a war did come. Although the US government had multiple extensive internal investigations trying to place blame somewhere for the deaths, likely on someone else, and although some agents were disciplined for improper actions, politician John Danforth headed a special counsel that issued a report in 2000 clearing the US government of any wrongdoings in its encounter with the Branch Davidians. Are we surprised? Now, here's where your instincts as a viewer and mine as a lawyer collide with language. Experts still debate whether the Branch Davidians were actually a cult. Dr. Steve Eckel argues that the term is stagnant, implying a binary that doesn't really exist. A group of people, or an association of people, if that's what you want to call them, are either a cult or not a cult. But experts prefer to discuss cultic relationships and cultic processes on a continuum. Some observers argue that, in this case, the government leaned on the word cult to rationalize excessive force, and the media jumped on it to make headlines and stir the pot. I mean, that's what got people viewing. That's how they make money. We had a charismatic leader, and who was also an absolutist leader, who believed he had the unique authority to interpret scripture and restructured morality around himself and his will. The Branch Davidians also had an isolation apocalyptic mindset, where they stockpiled weapons in anticipation of a prophesied conflict, while also living in a compound which was both physically and socially isolating. We have child abuse in a variety of forms, outside family ties severed, internal shaming, and the use of fear and intimidation against members who disagreed with Koresh. But at the same time, many scholars push against using the term cult. Nancy Ammerman, a sociologist of religion, urged people to engage in the Branch Davidians' theology rather than dismissing it as cultish fanaticism. That maybe the Branch Davidians were a new religious movement with high control and abusive practices used by Koresh specifically. Now, for me, it seems the debate here isn't necessarily whether the Branch Davidians were a cult. It's actually how and when we use the term cult. The characteristics of the Branch Davidians and Koresh's leadership seem to align with it being a cult. Now, of course, whether the Branch Davidians are a cult or if it's just Koresh's practices, that's a whole nother thing. But under Koresh, I would say it was a cult. That being said, using the term cult to other a group of people and justify excessive force is obviously problematic. But it gets hard. Do we dance around the use of a certain word because of how they may be used? What that word might justify? We need words, and we need strong definitions. And if we don't use the word cult, we simply will find another word to use to describe them, and that word will likely be weaponized. So I'm not sure what we're supposed to do here. I think what's important is that we engage with history through a nuanced lens, which allows us to build policies and actions that actually better our society, rather than pit American civilians against each other and also against the US government. Understanding what actually happened at Waco, what the Branch Davidians believed, how a cult is formed, what it means, all of that. That's how we make sure the term cult isn't used as a weapon to justify governmental abuse. Because at the end of the day, whether the Branch Davidians were a cult or not shouldn't matter in terms of holding the government accountable for its actions. They were American civilians with rights, and many of those inside that compound were victims of severe abuse. Here's the thing. Two things can be true at once. We can condemn the government's excess and also Koresh's abuse. Refusing to acknowledge this kind of complexity is how we repeat history. Because behind the smoke and the politics and all the media attention, there were real people involved in this situation. While some were the manipulative ones and the abusive ones, others were brainwashed and forced into a situation of groupthink. And even harder to stomach is that many were children with no say in the matter at all. We had the government promise a resolution and then engage in psychological warfare on its own citizens, contributing to escalation of the situation and the deaths of dozens of people, many of whom were already victims of Koresh himself. It's a tragic event that we need to be aware of, sit with, and better understand if we actually want a better future. So, with all of that, I want to thank you guys for sitting in and listening to me as I shared this historical event and dissected some of the nuance involved. I hope you come away with this or come away from this with something new learned, whether it be related to the event itself, defining a cult, or maybe something else. And then until next time, and until next week, stay safe and stay curious.